Hello, I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad, and welcome to the program. That was Barra, my producer. He was just laughing. I'm not quite sure what. Well, maybe it was at the fluency of my smooth delivery. I don't know. Perhaps it was something else. We'll never know. But anyway, welcome to the program. And today we're going to be talking about what is conservatism. I think in the age of Trump, and particularly at the time that we're recording this, we've just had Trump do his 90-day pause on the tariffs, which is either genius or mad, depending on your viewpoint and your politics. Obviously, I think it's mad, but I guess you might say I would. So I think one of the things about Trump and MAGA and a lot of the populist parties of the right in Europe that tend to have supported Trump, either tacitly or explicitly, over the last few years, they tend to think of themselves as true conservatives, as in they constantly say, well, we're the true conservatives, referring to whoever, probably someone in a centre-right party, like the Conservative Party in Britain, and they are not true conservatives. And of course, by that definition, that basically means that, at least in their minds, there must be some definition of true conservatism. So I'm going to attempt to do that today in the 20 minutes or so that we have. So I'm only going to lightly cover the history of conservatism. So before anyone comes at me, this is very broad brush stuff. So don't say you didn't mention Disraeli or William F. Buckley or whoever. I'm obviously not going to do that. I'm just going to try and... I'm not going to talk about every conservative-leaning thing that's ever happened to the entire universe. What I'm trying to get to is a history of a history and a definition of conservatism that can serve us going forward, if that makes sense. So, and one of the reasons I want to do this is because I think conservatism as an ideology is in serious trouble. Now, some of you will instantly come in and say, what do you mean conservatism is in real trouble? Trump's in the White House. He won, at least electoral college-wise, a sort of a landslide. The Democrats seem in huge amounts of problems. Left-leaning parties seem in huge amounts of problems. Just anything left-leaning seems to be have electoral difficulties. We're seeing, in Britain, we've got the Labour Party, and they're stuck, and they don't quite know what to do, and they're confused, and all that stuff. So people will say, what do you mean conservatism's in trouble? Again, Trump. But I would say Trump's not actually a conservative. And I know I'm playing the same game that the populist right people do by, saying there's true conservatism or there isn't, but I don't think that he is. You can have a very broad definition of what conservative is. But for instance, I think we could all agree that, say, Che Guevara was not a conservative. And I think Donald Trump is probably about as much of a conservative as Che Guevara was. So, here we go. Conservatism as a coherent ideology. Interestingly, while I was just putting together the research for this, figuring out what I wanted to say, I Googled conservatism. And the first thing I came up with was a definition, an attempt at a definition of conservatism. And it had two parts, which I think I actually want to just read, because I think it's kind of interesting and illustrates the points that I'm about to make. So, 1, commitment to traditional values and ideas with opposition to change or innovation. Okay? And then number 2 is the holding of political views that favor free enterprise, private ownership, and socially traditional ideas. Now, what the sharper amongst you will have noticed straight off is there is a contradiction between those two definitions. They don't sit together entirely comfortably, particularly given that free enterprise is all about innovation. It's about change. That's what it does. It is the engine. It's what it produces. That is what the free market produces. So you have to ask, how can people whose whole ideology is based on the idea that they don't like innovation and change be in favor of the free market, which is entirely driven by innovation and change? And I would say that this paradox sits at the heart of conservatism all throughout, certain recent history. And I would say that conservatism at its strongest, at its most electorally potent, deals with that paradox very, very well, and actually brings it all together quite neatly and creates basically huge tent coalitions that can dominate the electoral politics of the country for sometimes decades. So, but I think what's happening now is it's coming apart at the seams. The paradoxes are just ripping it all apart. So, right, if I wanted to chart the history of conservatism, obviously, well, I could start anywhere. I could start at the dawn of man. I was tempted, actually, to start at Plato, but then I thought, well, okay, what about the pre-Socratics? What about, I don't know, Pythagoras? How does he fit into the history of conservatism? But then, just thinking about it more and more, I thought... talking about anything pre-Age of Enlightenment, I don't think is going to work. I think we're talking about a world that is too distant from our own, and I just don't think the definitions of what is conservative or not would be applicable in any meaningful sense that we could talk about, and that would really help this conversation. So I decided, and some of you will approve, some of you will disapprove, to start with Edmund Burke. Now, Burke is described as he's often described as Anglo-Irish, but really, I mean, he was just Irish. He was born in Dublin in 1729. His mother was Catholic. His father was born Catholic, but converted to Anglicanism, and that's actually pretty key to Burke's whole worldview. He was he stayed close to Anglicanism his whole life, and it really, really, really shaped his ideological and philosophical viewpoints. It's also worth noting that Burke he was basically a self-declared liberal. He was a Whig. He was a Whig MP, actually, for around 30 years. So it's interesting that the father of modern conservatism was, in fact, a liberal. But I think, actually, that kind of gets to the heart of what we're about to talk about. Some basic stuff about Burke. I don't want to spend too much time on Burke. I could do a whole podcast on Burke. I could do a whole book on... I mean, Burke's a huge topic. But he was interested in aesthetics and considered them deeply philosophically important. In 1757, he was about 27 or 28 at the time, Burke published a work of philosophy entitled A Philosophical Enquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. There's a lot of huge ideas covered in that book, but I think the big one in terms of talking about the origins of modern-day conservatism is Burke basically thought that beautiful things are the things that we are drawn to that are ultimately healthy and will allow us to grow as people and are positive. They're just overall positive. And how he described things that are sublime are things that are superficially attractive but essentially lead us astray. A good example of that that's really obvious would probably be alcohol, right? You know, it's good in the moment, but over time it kills you and ruins your life and ruins your relationships, etc. And I think this is a really key. I think this is Burke's key contribution to the history of conservatism beyond everything else, because I think that if you look at conservatism pre-Burke, a lot of it was married to the idea that good and bad as concepts are basically designed by a higher power. So God or the king, or in some alliance between the Lord of the universe and the monarch. That's what's good and bad. And actually it can change depending on the whims of the God or the king. What Burke is talking about is an ideology that is material. It's firm, it's fixed. It's saying there are things in the world that are beautiful, there are things in the world that are sublime. We need to go towards the beautiful, avoid the sublime, and the people who can do that the best will have the most success and the most happiness in life. And of course, the important thing is that an individual can ascertain this. Yes? So it doesn't need to be someone doesn't need to be told by a king this is right or wrong. They can get to it themselves. This is really key, I think, to the whole idea of modern conservatism as it flows from Burke. After the French Revolution, we get into the 19th century, and there's a lot of contradictory ideas floating around within conservatism. You know, was democracy, is it good or bad? To what extent is democracy good or bad? Is it too much democracy? Those are huge ideas. Important to keep in mind about conservatism in this period, it believes in hierarchies and the centrality of the family because it sees those things essentially as the best way to maximize individual freedom. So basically, when, you know, it comes back to this beautiful and sublime. When everything's in order, people are happy, things work. When things get out of order, there's too much of the sublime, saying not enough of the beautiful, then everything falls apart. There's a big commitment to institutions as well for maximizing this. So schools and churches are just the most obvious. But the idea that institutions should be strong and they, when they work well, will maximize the happiness of the individual and the freedom of the individual, which is not exactly synonymous in sort of 19th century conservative thinking, but they're closely aligned, I think it's fair to say. So then we get to the 20th century, and what happens to conservatism is very interesting, because basically what happens is the old conservatism versus liberalism as the kind of the battle, the ideological battle that's going on in Western society, that breaks down. And instead of conservatives versus liberals, it essentially becomes conservatives versus socialists. So socialism really replaces liberalism as the main sort of opposite ideology to conservatism. Which then begs the question, what happened to the liberals? And they sort of got split between the two camps. So some liberals who were, I guess, more left-leaning would fall into the socialist camp, and a whole other bunch of liberals who cared about free markets, that sort of thing, went along with conservatives, became conservatives, essentially, or self-identified as conservatives. And so what happened was that had a huge influence on 20th century conservatism, just particularly given you suddenly had all these liberals, and that kind of pushed conservatism in a slightly liberal direction. It's where you end up by the end of the century near the end, with Thatcher and Reagan, two big supporters of free trade, free markets, that sort of thing. You obviously have other conservative ideas in the mix, particularly with those two people, but I think you can see what I'm getting at. Although I suppose Burke was a liberal, wasn't he? So I guess it was always confused. But anyway, it becomes, I think, more so as we get to the end of the century. And I think actually the Thatcher-Reagan era is worth just briefly touching on, because I think actually what happened with that is it was almost like conservatism tipped a little bit too much towards the liberal stuff, the free markets, the free enterprise. And because if you look, the summary of the 20th century I would probably give is the free market's good, but only when there's a strong sense of institutions underpinning it, church, school, family, etc. But there was a whole other wing of conservatism which was really just interested in particularly the church, particularly a sort of religious fundamentalist version of conservatism, which again Reagan had some of. So those contradictions were always there. They became very pronounced, I think, as we went into the 21st century. And I think as we got into the 21st century, the coalitions that had existed in the 20th century, they really start to break down. I think a big moment for 21st century conservatism was the events of September 11th, 2001 in Lower Manhattan. I think younger viewers will find this kind of quite interesting and counterintuitive, but pre 9/11, there was a lot of warmth towards Islam amongst conservatives in the West, because it was seen, as an, this is an institution, this is a religion. They aren't like the godless Reds, right? The Muslims have a religion which isn't a million miles from Christianity in lots of the basic, it's a monotheistic religion that comes from the Middle East. If you want a proof of stuff like this, it's there in popular culture. Rocky III is actually, oddly, a really good example. In that the Mujahideen in Afghanistan are the good guys. They're the guys that help Sylvester Stallone, Rambo, in his quest, whatever it is. I don't even remember what it is, what he's trying to do, but you get the gist. The point being is that within popular American culture, Islam was seen as, at least it's an ethos, basically. And then I think 9/11, that changes decisively, and we haven't seen the return really to the pre 9/11 view of Islam, certainly amongst conservatives in the West. And I think that's actually quite big, because suddenly it's like, well, is religious belief always a good thing? No, not necessarily. Okay, well, what does that mean? Then we get to the financial crash of 2008, which really seemed to strike at the heart of the infallibility of the free market, at least in some senses, and for a lot of people. If the system could fail on such a huge level, then perhaps conservatives could look and say maybe, capitalism is all it's cracked up to be. There was a period, I think, there really at the end of that first decade of the 21st century where a lot of conservatives sort of tried to rally around some of the 20th century ideas. I mean, take David Cameron. You can say what you want about David Cameron, but actually, and I know he did lots of things wrong, and I will probably agree with all the things that you guys think David Cameron did wrong. But, if you compare him to people like Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, there actually is a world of difference, only in the sense that I think Cameron was trying to understand the contradictions within conservatism, and he was trying to heal them or fix them. I don't think he succeeded at all. In fact, he ran up against a wall in the EU referendum. But nevertheless, I think he tried, and actually I think his failure has since meant within British conservatism, there's just no attempt. You basically float along and you don't worry about it. If you're Rishi Sunak, you stand in front of a sign that says "Stop the boats," while you're also supposed to be saying, the far right are loonies or whatever, and it just it doesn't really add up. And I think most people can see that, and leads to things like the rise of reform and Farage. But anyway, I digress. That's a whole other topic. Anyway, to wrap up here, all this leads up to the present day and Donald Trump. And I will say it, now that I've dragged you at breakneck pace, obviously, from Edmund Burke to the present day, I'll come back to Donald Trump not being conservative. And in fact, I will prove it using the original Google definition of conservatism, right? What is it? Let's go through it again, right? 1, a commitment to traditional values and ideas with opposition to change or innovation. None of that applies to Trump. I don't even understand how anyone could make the argument that it does. Not one word of it. He has zero interest in traditional values of any description. His whole life has been about being a disruptor. Again, not tacitly, but explicitly, he has constantly talked about himself as a disruptor. And that's what he's doing now. He's doing it now with the tariffs are on, they're off, they're all over the place. So, again, by any definition of conservatism, I don't understand how Trump fits into that, at least that first one. Let's look at the second tenet that the Google gave us. The holding of political views that favor free enterprise, private ownership, and socially traditional ideas. Well, for free enterprise, look at the tariffs. That's about as unfree enterprise really as it gets. It's governments meddling in markets to a massive degree. If anything, Trump, clearly fits neater in some ways into some of the traditions of the left, like his authoritarian streak, all that stuff. He likes government controlling things. He likes government being in charge. And again, that's, it doesn't make sense to any idea of the conservatism, the history of conservatism from Burke till today. Ann Coulter, the famous conservative spokesperson, writer, she had a quote once about how people are liberals, or everyone's a liberal or conservative, and clearly everyone fits neatly into one category. And I think they don't, actually. I think on a conscious level, I think most people who aren't involved in formal politics, party politics, etc., they're kind of whatever. They're a weird mix. Most people are a weird mix of conservative and liberal. Maybe they lean a bit more one way or the other when it comes right down to it. But actually, a lot of people who are self-declared liberals have loads of opinions that one would instantly identify as conservative, and vice versa. Lots of conservatives have very liberal ideas. So yeah, there we are. Trump isn't a conservative. I don't know where conservatism goes. And actually, the fact that Trump isn't a conservative, it's a great weakness. Anyway, I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad. Thank you to the Bloomsbury Radio and Bloomsbury Institute for hosting. Just want to say that obviously the opinions expressed here are not necessarily theirs. Please like and subscribe, yada, yada, yada. See you next time. Thank you.